In this module, we will outline some grand challenges and wicked problems in the food system and begin to explore different scales of the food system. When you watch this module, consider the following question. How do food systems and challenges around the food system look different on each scale?
So what are some of the challenges that really keep you up at night in this work, particularly around sustainability in the food system and feeding ourselves and keeping this planet healthy while we do it?
So I was thinking about this question, and I think my answer to that would really vary depending on what context I was in, right? And I think that itself is a really big challenge because people want there to be one grand challenge and we're going to tackle it and we're going to solve the problem, but there's problems and they're all of them are really wicked problems, extremely complex, and they're all sort of interrelated with one another. But when you, right, and this is the trouble at working across scales, as you go down to more of a local context where you're working in communities with households, right? These are very specific local problems, but they're still related to these very large problems.
I think one of the things that I've encountered and that makes this work so exciting and fascinating is the regional specificity of how these different concerns around food and access to food emerge, you know. And so we can think about urban and rural geographic context, right? And when we talk about, we can go back to the supermarket example, distance to supermarkets, when we're talking about ability to travel, you know, that's going to look different in these geographic contexts. We're talking about vehicle ownership versus access maybe to public transportation, or the ability to throw your groceries in a trunk and buy larger quantities of things at a certain time versus, you know, only taking what you can carry on your walk or on your bus ride, for example. I think, you know, having culturally relevant foods, what that looks like is based on where you live.
Here, we are discussing the differences from a consumer perspective around who has access and how certain groups access the food system, as well as how different cultural groups engage in the food system regarding what they eat and whether or not they have access to the food of their culture.
And so I grew up here and, you know, I really enjoy catfish as a seafood, you know, but in some of the other places that I live, catfish wasn't readily available. And, you know, luckily for me, I like different types of seafood, you know, but just having access to certain products that are meaningful can also be accessed, you know, in sustainable ways. But yeah, it also has introduced me to some other new foods and trying other new recipes and trying to incorporate that, and hearing how other people do that based on where they are and how they've done it differently. Yeah.
Let's take a closer examination of local, small-scale systems versus large, conventional scale systems. And secondly, how we measure sustainability influences our assessment of the effectiveness of the food system.
So what about folks who are really passionate about local food systems and the power of the local system to potentially be scaled?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the exercises that we do in Humanity in the Food Web is thinking about the different metrics that we can use to evaluate sustainability. And we offer up essentially a scenario where we ask students, which is more sustainable, an intensive system, so the conventional agricultural systems, or an extensive system, so more produced, kind of thinking that local farm level, not scaled to cities, but scaled to communities, small communities. And we let the students ponder it a little bit first and think about it, and most of them will typically divide out based on their own prior experiences, and we'll have the class split half and half. So half will say it's the conventional system and half will say it's the local system. So then we ask them why. And the reasons are where they divide out, and the science backs it up, right? So the conventional systems tend to be more sustainable if you're looking at resource utilization, if you're looking at, for example, fuel consumption, if you're looking at, it really is more efficient to do a whole lot in one place and use a very efficient distribution to send it to all the places it needs to go. So if you're using things like food miles, if you're using things like fuel consumption, energy consumption, it is very efficient to do things at scale. However, if you change your metric and you say the stimulation of the local economy, so if you take a different economic measure, local food systems are far more valuable to local economies. Okay. So you're keeping the money in the economy and you're distributing it locally within that community, and the impact on the community is much more significant.
What about environmentally?
Again, depends on what measure you use.
Okay.
And it also depends where you draw that boundary. So geographically, resources are strained in some places and not in others. So in some places, it's much better to produce it somewhere else and bring it in, because the resources to produce it are strained in that location. So producing in that location is not environmentally sustainable. So you either eliminate the product or you produce it somewhere else and bring it in. And on the flip side of that, when resources are abundant, the things that go into that product are abundant in that location, then it may be environmentally sustainable to produce it there. And so we can draw those boundaries all the way down to the community, to the state, to the region, to the country even, depending on what it is we're producing and what resources it uses.
There's a bit of an inherent conflict between small scale, sort of the romanticized idea of a production system, a small farm that was essentially responsible for its own food and some small amount of provision of food into a regional system. But again, if you just think about the simple numbers, there's a little under 2 million farms. There are a little fewer than 2 million farms in the US now. And call it 340 million consumers, just to make an easy number to divide by. So a farmer would have to supply enough input into the food system to feed 170 people on average. That's a really large number. So of course that complexity that goes along with the scale has completely changed.
In this module, you learned that there are differences in the ways we measure sustainability. You learned how to evaluate systems and sustainability, and finally, you learned that there are variations in local, regional, and global systems in terms of how people, profits, or the planet are impacted.